In the previous lesson, we introduced the first of the major principles of the British Constitution. This was the rule of law and the idea of the rule of law. In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the next of these major principles, which is this idea of a separation of powers between branches of government. We're going to take a theoretical as well as a comparative view of the idea of the separation of powers. Theoretical in the sense that we're going to explain the theory behind it, and comparative in the sense that we can compare it to other jurisdictional ideas relating to the separation of powers, namely and most importantly, the United States. So this is going to play quite nicely into your studies that you will do in your second year for A-level politics, which is relating to US and comparative. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how the US system works, just as a way to be able to clearly delineate between the UK and the US system. And this could be quite useful for any of you who are doing comparative politics as well. So part 2 of the principles relates to this idea of the separation of powers. This part 2 of 3, the third is obviously going to be on the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. So, simply put, and given a very broad and very basic definition of what we mean when we talk about the separation of powers, the principle of the separation of powers tells us that governmental power, not governmental power in the sense of how we define the government within the UK system, as in the executive branch, but government generally, theoretically, the idea of governing. This kind of power ought to be divided into a legislature, an executive, and a judicial branch of the government. The reason why I make it clear is because when we talk about UK politics, quite confusingly, the government is described as the executive branch. When we think about what the government is doing, we're talking about what the executive branch is doing. But when we think about what we mean when we talk about the government in terms of broader politics, just political theory or political science, we're talking about governing, the idea of government more broadly. It's a little bit complicated, but that's essentially the long and short of it. Now, the idea of a separation of powers is that each of these different branches of government should have their own distinctive personnel, they should have their own distinctive processes, their own distinctive powers, and each branch of the government should be checked so that no one single branch dominates the others and gets too powerful. So let's begin by thinking about some of the theoretical implications, and we'll begin by looking at Montesquieu's version of the separation of powers. What did Montesquieu say when thinking about this idea of separation of powers? According to this view, each is complemented by the idea of a mixed constitution, in which different class interests check and balance each other, particularly with reference to those that make law within the context of a governmental structure, this being the legislature, or in our country, in our system, the Westminster parliamentary system, or if we're talking about the US, if we're being comparative, we'll be talking about Congress. There is a vestige of the mixed constitution in the institutions of monarchy as well as the House of Lords, because the idea of the mixed constitution, cut off from its historical association with this idea of hereditary aristocracy, might actually be valuable as a check provider over the crude understandings of majoritarian democracy. So when we think about political theory, there is this idea that majoritarian democracy is a crude method by which decisions are made within a state structure, and that a useful check against this is this idea of hereditary aristocracy, the idea of a hereditary monarchical system, of an unelected branch of government, an unelected branch of the legislature, that being the House of Lords, these providing a useful check to this idea of majoritarian democracy. Somebody who is very pro-democracy, of course, will definitely critique this argument, because there is definitely strong arguments on the idea of having an elected House of Lords, for example, and having a republic rather than a constitutional monarchy, removing the monarchy from power. All of these different ideas are, of course, very popular and vogue ideas within the context of making major constitutional reforms in the United Kingdom going forward. So the question of judicial independence can be regarded as an aspect of the separation of powers. But it could also be regarded as an issue in its own right, and we will talk about judicial independence and judicial neutrality when we talk about the judiciary more generally as part of a chapter in A-level politics. And the idea here is that judicial independence in this context is safeguarded by the right to fair trial and public trial under the European Convention on Human Rights. For those who don't know, Article 6 of the European Convention on Human Rights protects the right to a fair trial. So we have this idea of a separation of powers, that power is separated between three branches of government: the legislature, that are the makers of law; the executive, that are the implementers and the setting of policy; and then you have the judiciary, who interpret the law and apply the law to certain cases and situations. Well, the separation of powers comprises separation of function, institutions, personnel, okay, and power itself in their ability to do things. So the function of Parliament, for example, is different to the function of the judiciary in the United Kingdom system. But this idea also implies the idea of a check and balance system as well. And this is really where we can look at the US system to have a bit of comparative analysis. Because when we think about this idea of separation of powers and this idea that we don't want any one branch of government becoming too powerful and therefore dominating the other, we get this idea of checks and balances. The idea of a check and balance, the idea of checks and balances in this sense is this idea of of certain powers that one branch has over other powers. And in the United States, they have a very strong constitutionally mandated system of checks and balances. So, for example, the power of judicial review, which is a power that is vested in the US judicial system, is the power to be able to strike down legislation that is passed by Congress that is unconstitutional. Now, we'll explain in the next lesson in the video about parliamentary sovereignty why that would be impossible in our particular system, although we still do have judicial review as a process in the United Kingdom, which we'll get to in future lessons' time. But this idea, therefore, means that the US Supreme Court has a certain amount of power and authority over Congress, such that if Congress acts out of step with the US Constitution and passes legislation that is essentially contradictory of any provision within the US Constitution or any of the amendments therein, the US Supreme Court can strike that down. And we also have other ways in which checks and balances can take place. For example, the power of the US president in the executive branch to veto legislation that is passed by Congress. And then there's the alternative to that, which is if a president does veto legislation that is passed by Congress, Congress can override that veto with a large enough majority. So these are all checks and balances that all allow essentially no one single branch of the US government to get too powerful and to dominate the other two. The particular blend in any given case when we think about this idea of separation of powers depends on the preoccupations of a particular country, as you would probably imagine. There is little agreement among writers as to whether the separation of powers is valuable in the sense that we apply it to the United Kingdom. Because in the United Kingdom, we do not have a formal separation of all three powers. We have a fusion of powers between the legislature and the executive branch of government. So the government, in the sense of the executive, actually sits in Parliament. They sit on the benches of Parliament. They sit on the front benches of Parliament. They conduct and pass and vote on legislation that is going to be passed through the parliamentary structure, which is obviously very different to other examples of other states around the world. There have been attempts, however, in recent years, specifically when we think about constitutional reform, to improve this idea of a separation of powers in the United Kingdom. So we know, and we shall know as we get to looking at constitutional reform more broadly, that the 2005 Constitutional Reform Act attempted to strengthen the separation of powers. They did so by creating a Supreme Court to replace the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords, because originally the highest court in the land was the Appellate Committee of the House of Lords, who were the law lords. So the highest judges in the land would sit in the House of Lords, and they would sit in judgment of legislation that was passed by the House of Commons and through the House of Lords. So there was an extreme fusion of powers between all three branches, all sitting in Westminster. And so the Constitutional Reform Act made that formal separation, put some clear blue water between Westminster and the Supreme Court that now sits across the square. There was also the injection of an independent element into the judicial appointments, and they removed the role of the Lord Chancellor as head of the judiciary as well as Speaker of the House of Lords. One of the big sort of no-nos is, as an idea within the separation of powers, is to have members of multiple different branches of government all being able to be shared by one individual. So you have an individual that has the joint power to be the head of the judiciary as well as the Speaker of the House of Lords, as well as having roles within the executive, which the Lord Chancellor had, then that, of course, it is just a shunning the idea of the separation of powers quite substantially.